Hello and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video. Today I'm going to speak to you about morality and Christians in particular with regard to how those two intersect. Are Christians more moral than atheists or is that a bit of a misnomer? Is that a bit of a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the data? What prompted me to talk about this was just a Facebook comment from someone I know from Malawi that I thought was really interesting. It's just sort of three short lines, but it encapsulated a lot of what I think could well be the case. I'd be interested to see what you guys think, especially people who have deconverted from religion, to see if they've noticed a difference in how they approach other people and they approach whether they are more tolerant or not. So this guy from Malawi said, in 2011, when I was highly religious, I deleted all secular music on my laptop. In 2022, when I'm highly humanistic, I keep all gospel music on my laptop. My experience, when religion made me more judgmental and condemnatory, humanism has made me more understanding and accommodative. So he feels that he is much more accommodating of other ideas and other people now that he is a humanist. And when he was highly religious, he would, and that's just a really nice example of tolerance. Really, I'm really highly religious. I'm going to delete every single piece of music that is secular off my computer and just maintain gospel music and Christian-based music. And now he's humanist. He's like, I'm going to have all that music and I'm going to keep that gospel music because I think it does something for me on occasion. And I think there's nothing wrong with appreciating it for what it is, as well as appreciating the full range of music that I might like and can listen to. I think that's a really nice encapsulation of what it's like to be tolerant and humanist. I wrote an article, a couple of years back on, it's called Christians, Their Morality and Their Ironic Intolerance. And I'll read you some of it. There's a lot of quotes that I take from that I won't hit you with, but I'll just speak you through the main sort of aspects of the article. And it starts, God is love, or something. Turns out very often Christians don't reflect this ideal. This is kind of understandable given the distinct lack of such an ideal in the Old Testament. But if we park that whole tranche of biblical history for the time being, let's look a little at the tolerance of Christians. What can we tell about the tolerance of Christians? Well, this will depend on what type of Christian we are talking about. A conservative Christian, if looking at moral psychology, will be defined by valuing the in-group, purity and tradition above all other moral evaluative components. Where liberals might be seen in terms of fairness and lack of pain, conservatives often see these as playing second fiddle to the other components. Thus, anyone not in the in-group is often seen as morally inferior. And here I'm simplifying the work of people like psychologists like Jonathan Haidt. So this is to say for Christians, well, for a lot of people, for political conservatives, the in-group is really important, which is people like you. So if I'm a heterosexual white middle-class male, which I am, and if I was politically conservative, I would be very much interested in a group of people that's just like that. And everyone who doesn't fit into that mould, I'm not too bothered about. They're in the out-group. This is all about the in-group. And that's really important for determining, your morality. And what happens, you'll find that certain people will be really, really kind and generous and loving to people in their in-group and really pretty morally horrible to people outside their in-group. And so you get this kind of weird dichotomy of like, is this person a good person? Well, they're good to people like them, but not good to people unlike them. So we might talk about terms like universal morality, which is how nice are you to pretty much everyone, no matter what their background. So if, as a conservative, you are a white, male, heteronormative Christian, good luck to anyone outside of your in-group. I see from regular commenters on my blog of the religious persuasion, as well as from pastors and church spokespeople, a distinct intolerance for anyone who does not fit the mould of their in-group ideal. Homosexuals, trans, atheists, non-Christians, and so on, are not shown the love that Jesus idealizes in his Good Samaritan parable, the quintessential endorsement of out-group morality. So that's to say that, and I think, you know, the Good Samaritan is probably the single most important lesson in the Bible, really, which is, and it's quite ironic that Christians don't appear to do this, which is, you know, you need to show love and kindness and, you know, morality towards people who are unlike you, who are out of your in-group, so who are in your out-group. And I think it's, you know, Jesus was saying this, and you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you had the Samaritans, and, you know, all these different people. He recognized that you need to be nice to your out-group. And of course, it appears that Christians really struggle with this, you know, and this is one of the core moral teachings of the New Testament, of Jesus. So many religious people claim that, hang on, Christians are far more charitable and morally good, you know, but the devil is in the detail. It turns out that whilst Christians appear to give more money in real terms to charities, it's worth looking in finer detail at the stats. It's also worth noting that Christian churches are registered charities, so the vast amounts donated to their own churches are counted as charity. That's super important. So in simple terms, Christians and the highly religious are more likely to give to their own, show moral behaviour towards the in-group than the out-group. Whilst atheists or liberals might give less to charity in real terms, they are more universally moral. They're more like Jesus' Good Samaritan. What's worse, it's not as if they fail to be prosocial and morally good to out-group members, but research shows they tend to be more morally aggressive. This is the Christians. So not only do they fail to be kind to people in their out-group, they're actually aggressive to people in their out-group. It's not like I'm not morally good to them, I'm actually actively morally bad to them. So that's quite an important distinction to make. And, you know, there are papers such as Principles of Religious Prosociality, Review and Reformulation by Preston, Ritter and Hernandez that make some interesting claims. I will read you a little bit. Historically, religion and religious belief have often been credited as a source of human morality. But what have been the real effects of religion on prosocial behaviour? So that's behaviour of kindness. A review of the psychological literature reveals a complex relation between religious belief and moral action, leading to greater prosocial behaviour in some contexts, but not in others, and in some cases actually increasing antisocial behaviour. In addition, different forms of religious belief are associated with different styles of cooperation. This body of evidence paints a somewhat messy picture of religious prosociality. However, recent examinations of the cognitive mechanisms of belief help to resolve apparent inconsistencies. So to continue, all major world religions share a theoretical belief in the golden rule, the prescription to treat all others as you would like to be treated. But in practice, the effect of religion on moral action has been less than golden. We have reviewed here evidence that individual differences in religiosity lead to different patterns of prosocial behaviour towards others, that religious belief fosters cooperation with only some targets under some circumstances. We also reviewed recent experimental research showing priming methods that showed religious priming can increase prosocial actions in some contexts, but increase antisocial behaviour in other contexts. So I'm just going to exemplify what that means. So priming is when you surreptitiously give someone a psychological clue or hint that triggers something in the mind subconsciously, and that can change their behavior. So what they're saying here is, if you prime a religious person to think that the person, so say someone has been mugged, supposedly been, and this is I think what the research are referring to, someone's been mugged and gets onto the bus, say they're wearing a crucifix, you're already priming, that person is already priming the people who are watching on the bus to think, oh, this person is religious and is Christian. So it turns out if religious people are primed to think that the person that they need to be feeling sorry for, being prosocial towards, kind towards, is one of their religious in-group, they will show great kindness to them. But if they get on the bus, I don't know, with a I don't know, a Darwin t-shirt or something like that, then they're priming those religious people to think, oh, here's an atheist, and they end up being more aggressive towards them. In other words, their morality and their prosociality it only goes so far as their in-group, and then it starts turning towards aggression. Building from this work, to carry on, we suggest a distinction between religious and supernatural aspects of the sacred, each associated with different moral principles. Activating the religious principle should motivate the protection of in-group values, and so can both facilitate cooperation with fellow group members while inhibiting prosocial behaviour towards outsiders. And that is exactly, what I would say, which is that that religious people tend to favour people in their in-groups, and the article I wrote, shows heaps of evidence for this, loads of different papers that basically show that well, for example, I'll just do a little bit here. This is from Vasilis Saroglu, who's does a lot of research into this kind of stuff. Religion's role in prosocial behaviour, myth or reality. And they state, but if you turn to empirical research, the answer to our question becomes more difficult and quite complex. On the one hand, self-report measures of different aspects of prosociality, volunteering, helping behaviour, agreeable personality, part of the big five, low psychoticism, forgiveness, valuing benevolence, sense of generativity, provides systematic evidence in favour of the above theories. Religious people report being prosocial, and they do so across a large variety of the above mentioned ways in which prosociality is expressed. What this says is that religious people will self-report that they're really kind and prosocial. And this is the problem with an awful lot of psychological research. You need to look at the methodology. So it turns out that self-reporting statistics that are based on self-reports are notorious for being, not particularly accurate, because it's people saying what they think the people testing them expect them to say, or what they think of themselves that might be quite distinct from the reality of their own behaviour. So I might think I'm really generous, but actually in reality, when you compare me objectively against other people, I might not be very generous at all. But the fact I think I'm generous might be completely distorted by whatever variables. Maybe my own religiosity is going to distort the way I think, and I hear all these stories about, the Good Samaritan and this and that, and all the moral stories of the Bible that makes me think, hey, I'm Christian, I am clearly very moral and good. But actually the reality might be very different. But if you are going to generate statistics and data based on self-reporting, you are going to get arguably a very distorted picture of morality across society, and it might be that religious people are far more moral if the data is based on self-reporting, because religious people are more likely to self-report higher than non-religious people, for example. So, and this piece continues. Interestingly, this prosocial tendency as a function of religion seems to be universal. For instance, the high agreeableness of religious people seems constant across countries, religions, and even cohorts, and the importance of the value of benevolence among religious people is typical of Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist samples. On the other hand, there are many counterindications, or at least findings, implying skepticism, especially, but not only, when we move to studies using measures other than self-report questionnaires. So this is what I was saying. First, the tendency of religious people to volunteer may simply be an artifact of belonging to religious organisations that happen to organise volunteer-type activities. In other words, they're not really selecting to do volunteering, but it's just expected of that organisation. So you say, you know, if you want to be a member of this church, you have to do like 5 hours volunteering a week. And, you know, are you doing that for the good of you doing that, or are you doing that to fit in with your church and to get social acceptance and climb up the authority ladder in your church? You know, there's an awful lot going on here, and this, you know, that's why I say the devil's in the details. Second, the size of the associations between religion and prosocial measures is usually weak, not exceeding, for instance, 0.2 for agreeableness and benevolence. Third, not all religious dimensions imply prosocial tendencies. Fundamentalist, orthodox, and in some cases even intrinsically religious people often show prejudice, discrimination, or at least lack of prosociality towards outgroups, what we were saying earlier, or people threatening their values. 4, and more importantly, social experiments demonstrate that the motivation of prosocial behaviour among the intrinsically religious is not altruistic but rather egotistic, and need to be perceived by others as good, and the non-consideration of the real needs as expressed by the persons asking for the help are dominant. Exactly what I was saying. So is this all about me trying to fit in and, you know, it makes me look good and it's about my status rather than doing the good for the sake of the good? Finally, even for forgiveness, which is particularly emphasised within religion, results based on measures other than self-report questionnaires are rather disappointing. And I'm not reading you out all the references that are made for each of these claims, but they're packed with references. And, you know, the links, I'll put the links down below. I did say I wasn't going to read these out, but actually it's too good not to read this stuff out. The contrast between the ideals and self-perceptions of religious people and the results of studies using other research strategies is so striking that researchers may be tempted to suspect moral hypocrisy in religious people. For instance, Baston et al. 1993 suspected moral hypocrisy in religious people with regard to prejudice. Social experimental studies did not confirm the universal brotherhood ideals and even provided evidence to the contrary. Intrinsically religious people seem to need to appear prosocial rather than to really be so. Wow, that's so interesting. So, you know, religious people self-report being more prosocial, kind, moral, but actually it appears they do so because appearances really matter, but they're not really actually those things. Or if they are doing those things, they're doing them for egotistic reasons rather than for the good of the things themselves. I previously quoted, this is me speaking, Sarah Glue's work with Joanna Blagowska. So this is really interesting. This is what I was talking about with regard to the in-group and the out-group and that the bus scenario where someone's been mugged and, you know, they get on a bus and how do people feel towards that person. So in this paper is called Religious Fundamentalism and Limited Prosociality as a Function of the Target. Quote, 2 distinct research traditions have established that A, religiosity implies prosocial tendencies, though limited to proximal targets, and B, religious fundamentalism, RF, it's important, religious fundamentalism relates to prejudice, often because of underlying right-wing authoritarianism, RWA, right-wing authoritarianism. So religiously fundamental people are often also right-wing authoritarians politically, and so that really affects their prosociality, their kindness, their moral behaviour. So through 2 studies, we investigated the idea that RF, religious fundamentalism, due to underlying religiosity, also predicts prosociality that is limited to proximal rather than distal targets, your in-group rather than your out-group. Specifically, we found that RF, unlike RWA, so religious fundamentalists, unlike right-wing authoritarians, and because of religiosity, predicted prosociality towards a non-feminist but not a feminist target in need. So this is where the politics and the religion get intermingled. Experiment 1, and willingness to help friends but not unknown people in need in the same hypothetical situations. Experiment 2, so again it's your in-group, it's your friends, your family, your people like you. Moreover, like RWA, so like right-wing authoritarians, religious fundamentalists imply negative attitudes towards the feminists. This limited, not extended prosociality of people scoring high on religious fundamentalism was in contrast with their self-perceptions of being universally altruistic. Exactly what I was saying. Fundamentalism seems to combine religiosity's qualities, in-group prosociality, with authoritarians' defects, out-group derogation. So what this means is religious fundamentalism and right-wing authoritarianism come together in this perfect storm of being really nice to your in-group and really horrible to your out-group, or, more horrible to your out-group. So there you go. In another paper, they looked at aggression towards a moral out-group, so a gay person. So in this paper is called Religious Prosociality and Aggression. It's real. So to quote this paper, in 2 experiments using the same measure of religiosity and samples from the same population, religiosity predicted helping in a real-life context of an in-group member in need. Experiment 1, as well as an overt and direct aggression by means of allocating hot sauce to a gay and not to a neutral target. Experiment 2, religious prosociality and aggression are real, concern distinct kinds of targets and are at the heart of personal religiosity. So this is one of these experiments where you can do slightly nasty things, but it's only using like hot sauce and taste and whatever. So it's like you're not actually being aggressive in any kind of physical way, but what you do is you map that kind of behaviour out into a larger context. And indeed, Saraglu, this is me again, sees religion, quote, religion as a major contemporary cultural source of intergroup conflict around the world. And that comes from Intergroup Conflict, Religious Fundamentalism and Culture, the paper, again, that Saraglu is involved in. So as ever, there are biases at play when looking at the perceptions of prosociality and agreeableness. Atheists come out lower to religious people regardless of who is doing the rating. So this is a really interesting thing to note, that atheists, even to other atheists, score much lower on ratings of trustworthiness and all sorts, and it's a real problem because it leads to all sorts of biases. It's why atheists come out the bottom of people who you'd vote for president, and these create stumbling blocks for progress in society, particularly in America, where atheism is not the norm, and it's swimming up, upstream against the current in trying to get sort of representation and get equality, of opportunity in certain areas. So Luke Galen et al. Investigate in the paper Personality Ratings are influenced by religious stereotype and in-group bias. So they say a religious prosociality stereotype exists such that religiosity and prosociality are presumed to be positively associated, as evidenced by proxy measures such as personality traits. However, so this is like, we assume the more religious you are, the kinder you are. However, studies using self and peer ratings of agreeableness and conscientiousness have not simultaneously controlled for the religiosity of the participant and the target. So this is going back to what we were talking about in previous experiments, that actually, you are kind, but only to your in-group and not to your out-group. So that's your target. So 160 students completed measures of religiosity in a pre-screening survey. Later, participants rated an array of targets, including a Christian and an atheist, on adjectives corresponding to agreeableness and conscientiousness. Regardless of participant religiosity, atheist targets were rated as being lower in agreeableness and conscientiousness relative to those labelled as Christians. This bias was greater for highly religious participants. This effect was mediated by perceptions of the morality of the target, independent of participants' broader attitudes concerning the target's religious group. This is a bit of a problem for atheists going forward. So back to me, the bias towards the religious in-group is well documented. Religious people don't seem to like being moral to out-group members, as we have amply seen above. So in the stuff I've already talked about. So Joanna Rutschika Tran analyses, I'm probably butchered that name, analyses in Love Thy Neighbour the effects of religious in-out-group identity on social behaviour. She says, in the article, keeping with the hypothesis that people use religious identity to regulate their norm-directed behaviour appropriately toward in-out group members, 2 natural experiments took place in the centre of Gdansk city. The samples consisted of bystanders, passengers travelling by tram, and customers shopping in a supermarket where religious identity of the target was manipulated. In study 1, a female student simulates a broken leg. So this is pretty much similar to the kind of being mugged study. In fact, I don't know if she was one that did that. In study 1, a female student simulates a broken leg and walks with crutches. She tries to get a seat on a tram in 3 manipulation conditions. Maybe it was this one and I've just misremembered it. Wearing a religious habit as a Christian nun in group, a hijab as a Muslim out group, and a black t-shirt with the word God crossed out as an atheist. In study 2, a male student simulates queue jumping in a supermarket wearing a religious habit as a Christian priest, a Jewish skull cap as a Jew, and a white t-shirt as a secular man. The results confirmed the stated hypothesis that helping and submissive behaviours was directed only to the in-group religious members but not toward religious outsiders. The given findings are discussed in the context of social identity theory and have led to the conclusion that, in practice, love thy neighbour golden rule applies only to the religious in-group. And she continues, summing up a lot of the work I would otherwise be citing myself. Findings from study 1 suggest that intergroup bias towards religious outsider, even in need, seems to be stronger than the Good Samaritan impulse. The paradox is that the story about the Good Samaritan illustrates a need to be helpful toward individuals even if they do not belong to one's in-group. Theologically, most biblical scholars argue that the point of the parable was to demonstrate that one's identity and helping behaviour should move beyond ethnic borders to include all humans as their neighbour. However, our studies examined reductions in helping toward outgroup members. So in practice, this golden rule can be expressed as the more pragmatic and egoistic motive of love thy neighbour who is similar to you. Also, the religious in-group seems to have higher compliance for breaking social norms that is permitted for the religious outsider. So that's to say that, you know, when you've got this queue jumping person, if they're in your religious in-group, you forgive them far more. The results from study 2, and we do that generally, like we're always going to forgive people who are more like us, it is part of human nature. So there is that. The results from study 2 confirm the hypothesis that customers would become assertive when they saw a Jew queue jumping, even more so than if they saw a secular man doing the same thing, because this was a violation of the rule about queuing. Customer turned a blind eye to a religious in-group member that can be viewed as an example of compliance with social norms, not being against the sacred authority. However, such effect does not apply to religious outsiders. So I suppose that's to say that if you're Christian, you'd forgive a Christian priest doing this bad thing, but perhaps in that study, it's even you treat the Jewish religious person even worse than the secular because you expect them to be so much sort of better, but they're not. And so, you know, that throws some more, you know, interesting ideas into the mix. And she goes on to say, I'm missing out a good deal here, but this suggests that religion per se is to some extent responsible for antipathy between groups, in that religious groups function according to the same principles as political, ethnic or other groups. A tendency to respond negatively to outgroup members is pervasive among people who identify with their religious in-group members, because so doing enhances their collective self-esteem. It seems that activation of the love thy neighbour attitude is positively associated with universal cooperation and helping behaviour only in a homogeneous context, but not in heterogeneous groups or outgroup member, even religious. wherein individuals perceive a conflict of interest between their group and other religious groups. Such findings confirmed empirically the theoretical background presented by Galen in 2012, who assumed that when studies assess prosociality in non-planned spontaneous context, e.g. bystander helping, and if the target of prosociality is an outgroup member, the relationship between religiosity and prosociality is essentially zero, or even negative. Our results are also consistent with empirical findings regarding religion's dual function as a social identity and as a belief system. Religion offers epistemological and ontological certainty, and these can promote individual well-being, for example, by increasing the availability of social support and providing a sense of belonging to a religious group, but it simultaneously serves as a basis for seemingly intractable intergroup conflicts. That's to say that whilst religion can give you benefits of well-being, it can also drive a wedge between you and others. And that goes on and on. Another paper by Blogowska and Saraglu, for better or worse, fundamentalists' attitude towards outgroups as a function of exposure to authoritative religious texts, is also interesting. So fundamentalism not only predicts, this is a quote from the paper, not only predicts prejudice towards outgroups, but also prosociality toward proximal targets and the in-groups. Yep, we've said that already. Taking these things a step further, we hypothesize that because fundamentalists tend to show submission to religious authority, their attitudes towards unknown targets and outgroups may vary significantly depending on the nature of the authoritative religious texts to which they are exposed. In 3 studies using hypothetical scenarios, the association between fundamentalism and prosocial attitudes A became negative after exposure to a violent biblical text, B reversed from negative to positive after reading a prosocial biblical text, and C became negative or positive following a violent versus prosocial biblical text. So additional results confirmed the uniqueness of fundamentalism compared to general religiosity, quest orientation and authoritarianism regarding such dependency upon religious authority. Findings also support the mediating roles of reported submissiveness to religious teachings and perceived symbolic threats. Which is to say, if you are feeding yourself on a diet of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and some of the more violent passages of the book, then this is going to affect your morality and your prosociality. If you read a lot more of the New Testament, hopefully, you read the Good Samaritan a lot, hopefully that's going to influence the way you behave in a more positive way. And then there might be interesting conversations you can have around the Quran, because I've read the Quran, right, and I found it really dehumanizing. I think it's not a nice text, and you have to do a lot of mental contortions in order to take all the good bits out and forget all the bad bits. Because there really are a lot of quite explicit things that as a non-religious humanist, I felt dehumanized reading it. So again, the importance of the text that you read and how that interacts with your prosocial behavior or causes your prosocial behavior or inhibits your prosocial behavior, it appears to be pretty important. The point being of all of this is that Christians often claim that God is a source of objective morality and that God is love. But there is clearly a lack of clarity here, because it doesn't seem to matter what is the grounding of morality in actual fact, because Christians have wildly different approaches to morality and prosociality. Though what can certainly be said is that when they get progressively more conservative in terms of your right-wing authoritarianism, politically speaking, and fundamental, they become less universally moral. And if you think that this is, if you think Jesus, life is about following the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus very clearly is presenting the Good Samaritan as at least one of the stories of loving thy neighbour, then actually the more religiously fundamental you become, the less you adhere to those kinds of moral teaching. If you're a conservative Christian, like your fellow conservative Christian, you'll be all right by then. But if not, good luck. If you're an atheist, you might be out of luck. So the idea that Christians are more moral than atheists is highly problematic. And if they give more money to charity, you need to check what those charities are. Is it ending up just giving more money to their churches, which then gets applied into spreading the good news, buying Bibles? So instead of sending earthquake help to Haiti, they send a whole bunch of Bibles, because it's all about witnessing and converting more people. Then is that really, pragmatic, universal, pro-social moral help? And the problem is, of course, Christians will say, well, this gives them a chance of getting to heaven forever, and that it's also difficult to untangle. But certainly there's a lot of examples of giving to charity and being pro-social is about just maintaining your own in-group and making sure they're all right. I'm all right, Jack, and all the people like me are all right, and I'm going to help them, and I'm going to give loads of money to them and sort these people out. Everyone outside that in-group, they can sod off. And not only will I not give them money or not give them help or kindness, I'll be actively aggressive towards them. And that's a problem. Anyway, thought that might be of interest. Hopefully I'll get all the links and to the papers I was quoting from. As ever, question everything, particularly claims like that. Whenever you hear these claims, psychological research is interesting because there's such wildly varying methodologies that take place, and some methodologies are so poor in the way that they conduct these experiments and investigations. So you've got to look into fine details. You've got to think, right, is this a self-report? Or is there some kind of objective measure that's far less susceptible to bias? And stuff like that. Really important. Anyway, question everything, particularly yourselves, and I'll see you soon.